Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5 virtual tour with Kevin Adkisson. I am the curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today I am over in a spot that some of you probably have no idea where I am, and some of you probably come here all the time. We are at the Cranbrook House Garage sort of complex. So if you've visited Cranbrook House Gardens, you've probably walked along the house's driveway behind me into the gardens. If you are a volunteer with Cranbrook's House and Gardens Auxiliary, which that's open to anyone to sign up to become a volunteer, then you know the garage behind me is where so much of Cranbrook's grounds and gardening materials are kept. It's also the site of a series of pretty phenomenal murals. And so today's Live at 5 is going to be exploring the 4 murals that are quite humbly hidden in the garage, painted by the eldest child, the oldest son of George and Ellen Scripps Booth, James Scripps Booth, in 1914. Now, just to give you a sense of where we are, the sunken garden is sort of down below, and you can just see the twin cottages, which are some of the housing for our faculty there. And you can see the Cranbrook House greenhouse running along there. And this complex of garages, greenhouses, staff housing really developed between 1908, when George and Ellen Scripps Booth, Cranbrook's founders, moved into Cranbrook House on their property, until the 1920s, when they began to focus on building up the Cranbrook institutions. And so in that first decade that George and Ellen and their children were here at Cranbrook House, it was sort of a constant series of additions, including this wonderful spiral staircase that goes up. Remember that Cranbrook House's gardens are all terraced in the Italianate style, and so it is a pretty hilly property. And so you have these instances where you have a sort of semi-enclosed spiral staircase leading up to Tower Cottage, which is where Warren Scripps Booth and his family would eventually move. And then even the property's water tower is here, and the water tower is missing its sort of half-timbered Tudor-Beethan topper that actually had the water tank in it. And so we're just seeing the base of the water tower below. And then Cranbrook's original fire station was actually this little split here. So these two buildings were originally separated, and the fire truck lived there. And then Tower Cottage, which was designed by Albert Kahn with some pretty major additions by Marcus Burroughs a little bit later, was down here. So that's sort of showing you where I am. We're really in the back of house here today for our little mural tour. And interestingly, this series of garages wasn't added into the sort of estate until after the west wing and the library wing of Cranbrook House were added. So Cranbrook House, with its lovely little oval forecourt, there was originally a 3-car garage there. And in that garage, the family had both the ice box, where they would cut up blocks of ice from the lake and store them inside the house, but it was also a place where their son James Scripps Booth did India ink murals of automobile races. When they built this garage, this is where James and his uncle, as well as a distant family relation, began to work on building automobiles. And so it not only housed the Booths' cars, but it was also a place where James was designing cars, and where he was designing different sort of innovations and experiments in mechanization. So we'll head into the garage, and I should step back a little bit just to show you the sort of beauty of these garage doors. And at the end of the tour, I'll close the garage doors for you so you can see how it works. We have some wonderful photos of the booths exiting in all of their sort of experimental vehicles. Their most famous, James's most famous car, the Biautogo, which was a two-wheeled vehicle. We have a picture of James and one of his siblings careening out of these garage doors. And I love the way that this sort of booth granite walls that were so iconic for forming the perimeter of the Cranbrook property here is used to create both retaining walls and the building and this pretty inventive little connecting point that links the water tower to this garage. But let's step inside. I mentioned it's still a workhorse, so this is still the main place where our grounds crew and where our House and Gardens volunteers store their materials. But now we have come to the subject of today's Live at 5, which is this group of 4 murals painted about 1914. The 3 in the center were all painted around the same time, and then the last mural that actually shows that Biautogo was painted a little bit later and is a little bit shorter than the rest. Now, you're seeing some different creative features. We don't really store cultural properties in here. So these are not necessarily things from the Booth era. And so this horse is something from the House and Gardens. It was used in the garden for a show. So this is not sort of Cranbrook history property. This is more contemporary use. Now, before I talk about each of these individual murals, I just want to say a little bit more about James. So James was born in 1888. He was born at the Trumbull Avenue house of his grandfather, James Edmund Scripps, Ellen's father. He studied at the Detroit University School and then at the St. Luke's School for Boys in Wayne, Pennsylvania, but he dropped out in 10th grade. And for a family like the Booths, as wealthy as they were, as educated as Ellen was, to have your son drop out of prep school was not exactly what they had expected. Warren would, of course, go on to finish prep school and study at Yale. Henry went on to Asheville for prep school and then studied at the University of Michigan. But James was the more artistic kid, the more mechanical kid, and so he dropped out of high school at 10th grade, and he came back here to Cranbrook, where he began disassembling the family's 1904 Winston automobile and rebuilding it. And if you go over to Cranbrook Archives, we actually have much of James's childhood materials, including his school books. And in his school books, he was always sketching cars and he was sketching mechanical implements. So really, school was not what he wanted to do. He wanted to be working with machines and with cars. He would end up working for the Detroit Evening News, which is where he learned how to sort of communicate with language, but he was also an illustrator. And so in 1908, he was already creating his first belt-driven two-wheeled car prototypes. In 1910, he was both the writer and the illustrator for the Hupp Motor Company. And then he later that year married Jean Alice McLaughlin, and they traveled to Europe for their honeymoon, took a grand tour with 2 cars that James shipped over for the grand tour, as well as, of course, a nurse, a chauffeur. They really traveled in style. It was at that point in Europe that in 1911, James enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts, the great art school in France, where he studied with a fellow Michigan native, but living in France, Myron Barlow. And you may know that name from his paintings at Kingswood, as well as at Thornley. So James and Alice were living in Paris. They were, exploring the sort of European racing culture as well as European art. And Alice was a great poet and writer. However, they return in about 1912, 1913, and George Booth gives his eldest son a $25,000 loan, which was a princely sum in 1913. And James, as well as his uncle, William Scripps, and John Betterman set up the Scripps Booth Auto Company. And that's when they begin to develop the Biautogo, which is a two-wheeled car. It's a two-wheeled car that also has two little side stabilizing wheels. Now, this one, as you can see, James has titled the mural, the Biautogo Perfected. And so this is a pretty later model. There is, to my knowledge, and I'm not a car expert, nor am I a James Scripps Booth expert. So if you're watching this live and you can correct me with a comment, go ahead. If you're watching this later, feel free to leave another comment, because I'm sure I'm sort of missing some of the details, because there are some great automobile and James Scripps Booth fans out there. But what's cool about this cycle car is that it has this really amazing V8 45 horsepower engine on it. And it was the first V8 engine to come out of a Detroit company, coming out of the Scripps Booth Auto Company. It had 37-inch wood and spoke wheel. It was about 45 horsepower. And you can just see on the edge these little stabilizing outrigger wheels, which would come into action as you were turning corners. And as Carolyn just mentioned, it was designed to deliver Detroit newspapers. It was also designed to be a racing car. So James had a deep love of auto races, seeing how fast you could go in the car. Now, there is one Biautogo that is still functioning. It was given by James to the Detroit Historical Society. It was just restored in 2017, shortly after it was on display at Cranbrook Art Museum. And so that car is still around and is still running. And it had wonderful external copper radiators that you can see sort of coming down the front. And so you can search online for images of the Scripps Booth Biautogo. I think that is probably what the Scripps Booth company is most famous for. But the company did go on to create other automobiles. So in 1913, they launched the JB Rocket and the Packet. There are examples of those in the collection of the Henry Ford, and I think the Rocket is actually currently still on display. So if you head over to the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, you can see the JB Rocket on display. And then in 1914, the company launched the JSB, which Tom Booth, who is usually watching these live at Fives, Tom Booth has one of those 1914 Scripps Booth autos, and so you'll sometimes see him driving around Birmingham Bloomfield Hills. And that really was the most commercially successful of their cars. It had four wheels, not two, but still a very cool car. And the Scripps Booth company and James Scripps Booth in particular were responsible for a number of pretty impressive innovations. When you think that they're working here in Detroit is this very small company, they were one of the first cars to include spare wheels and spare tires. They were some of the first to put a center horn button. So instead of squeezing the horn to the side, you would push it in the middle of the steering wheel, which I think we're all familiar with. And they also had electric locks on the car. And again, this is 1914. And again, I mentioned the Biautogo was one of the first Detroit-made V8 engines. And unfortunately, the company was pretty short-lived. In 1916, James left the company, and it was shortly thereafter sold to General Motors and became part of the GM companies. And of course, the Scripps Booth badge was no longer used. Now, I mentioned that he was an artist, self-trained artist. In the collection of Cranbrook archives, we have many, many dozens of his beautiful watercolors, as well as his India ink drawing, pencil drawings, and pastels. He didn't tend to use oil paints like this mural. A lot of his work in the archives and at Cranbrook Art Museum is very soft, very ethereal. When he was a kid, he was doing all of the yearbook drawings, which is very similar to Eero Saarinen, who did all of the yearbook drawings for the Birmingham High School yearbooks when he was there. James would go on to have a long career, but he loved his art so much that he didn't really sell much or give much away. And so there's not much of a sort of, unfortunately, he's not known very well as an artist outside of Cranbrook, even though he really was incredibly talented. Now, in 1917, he, Alice, and the two kids moved out to Pasadena, where they had a third child. They lived in Pasadena until 1923, which is when James and Alice and the three kids came back to Detroit, and he invented the Da Vinci automobile, which was unfortunately ripped off by the Stutz Company. James then engaged in a 10-year lawsuit. He won the lawsuit, but by that point, Stutz had gone under, and the Da Vinci was a 10-year-old car in a rapidly changing industry. In World War II, James wrote a guide to auto mechanics that was actually adapted by the American Red Cross and used in the field in World War II to help train auto mechanics. And in the 1950s, after Alice passed away and James remarried, the family relocated to New Canaan, Connecticut, and he would spend the rest of his life in Connecticut, dying in 1954. So that's the sort of arc of this pretty impressive son of George and Ellen Booth from 1888 to 1954. He was an artist, he was a philosopher, he wrote a book late in life, analysis of the Bible. He really deserves, I think, even more attention, and I'm hoping, I was shocked that these murals had not been featured in a blog written on the Cranbrook kitchen sink, but I'm going to have to hop to that because I feel like this Live at 5 is really just the tip of the iceberg of what we have in the collections about James, and just the tip of the iceberg about what we can learn about these murals. So now that we know a little bit more about the artist, I want to move on to the next three paintings. So remember, the first smaller painting, which is added a little bit later, is of the Scripps Booth design by Automotive Perfected. The next are a series of races. And I was unable to determine, though I think we have the answer, I just couldn't find it today, what year he is painting all of the races that he's depicting. So they're painted in 1914, but remember, James and Alice were living in Paris from about 1910 to 1912. And so he's probably painting races that he saw. And so we start here with the mechanic's viewpoint. And so the driver would have sat in front, the mechanic behind, and so we're looking over the driver. Notice the driver is sitting on the right, not the left. And underneath the painting, he has conveniently given us the name of the cars. And so in this scene, we see a Crossley as well as a Sunbeam. And these are both English-made cars. The Crossley company started, or the Crossley Auto started being made in 1904. It was known as the English Mercedes, and it was invented by a J.S. Critchley, who was had studied with Daimler in Germany. And so the English Mercedes is up ahead in red with its spare tire on the back. And I love the way that James just really creates this action-packed scene. As the telephone poles come zooming past, the trees are sort of just a blur in the view of the mechanic. And then on the right is the Sunbeam. The Sunbeam Company is another English car maker. They started in 1888 as a bicycle manufacturer, and they created cars from 1901 until 1934, and they sort of petered on as a conglomerate into the 1970s. But I think he's really captured both the Crossley and the Sunbeam Company at their peak when they were making racing cars before World War I. Now, in between each of the murals are these wonderful sort of botanic scenes of trees growing up. And I love the ribbon that runs across and connects it all. And having looked at a lot of James's artwork, in the archives, the Art Museum at Thornley, this very thick line that divides them. I think very typical of an artwork in the early 20th century, particularly someone like James, who was doing both commercial illustration, like I mentioned for the Hupp Auto Company, as well as for the yearbooks, but then going into fine art. So he's sort of taking, I think, that thick line from commercial illustration and bringing it into the painting as a way of framing these more painterly murals. He has almost this graphic link of the greenery and the ribbons. Now, the next mural is of the Grand Prix, the Grand Prize, which is one of the oldest and most august races. It still is going on in France today. The Grand Prix began in 1906, but it actually has its roots all the way back to 1894. One of the very first car races in France in 1894 became formally the Grand Prix or the Grand Prize in 1906. Now, he painted this in 1914, and that might lead us to believe that he was painting the 1914 Grand Prix, which is one of the most famous auto races in the history of automobile racing. It's been described as the most important car race before World War I. And the 1914 Grand Prix was pitting the Peugeot company of France against Mercedes of Germany. But if you notice, though it's painted in 1914, we have a Peugeot versus a Belgian Nagant. I do not speak French, so please forgive my pronunciations. And so we have the Nagant in front, which is a Belgian car, the Peugeot, the French in the back, and Mercedes isn't here. So my speculation, and I probably can find out the correct answer, is that he is actually painting a Grand Prix that he saw, so 1911, 1912, 1913, and not necessarily depicting the most famous of the Grand Prix, the 1914 Grand Prix. Again, this combination of oil paints, background, and racing cars to really create this phenomenal sense of movement. If you look at how he's rendered the roadway and the sidelines, it's all sort of speed and fast and dust in the distance. He's blurring out these buildings. And then up above, you have the train that is zooming across over the roadway. And these races were taking place on city streets. And so they would close the city streets and then zoom through here, likely Lyon, France. And then on this side, we have a little French cottage as well as the electrical pole again. And the electric pole seems so familiar to us, but I think that James is including them here as well as in the other. These are all signs of modernity. The electrification of the rural European countryside, the introduction of speed and car racing, all of it sort of depicted here in oil paint on the wall of the garage. Now, the next painting, which goes across this pole, I'm not sure if that was painted by James or if someone lovingly reproduced the background in front of the drain pipe there. We come to the last of our series of paintings, and this one is the tourist trophy on the Isle of Man. Today it's known as the Isle of Man TT. Again, a legacy race that began in 1907 and continues to this day. The Isle of Man Tourist Trophy race is considered one of the most dangerous car races in the world because it is so the race course, which is some 57 miles long, is full of sort of hairpin turns and other exciting obstacles to the car. As I was preparing for today's Live at 5 and I was reading about these races that I knew nothing about prior to today, it was interesting to learn that the reason the English were racing on the Isle of Man is that in 1903, the Motor Act was passed by the English Parliament, and that set a nationwide speed limit of 20 miles an hour. However, the Isle of Man is a separate governance structure from the mainland of England, and so a bunch of London automakers and racers got together and approached the government on the Isle of Man and said, can we bring our races to your city streets? We've been outlawed here in the mainland. And so, again, we see two different cars racing, but now I believe, based on James's helpful guide, that these are both Minervas. And the Minerva Car Company was a Belgian company that operated from 1902 until the 1930s. And Minerva is probably most well known among automakers, according to my research. Again, I'm not an expert in cars, for converting many of their sort of luxury racing and luxury touring cars into armored cars during World War I. And so these were used on the German front to sort of speed in and out as almost observation cars, as well as to sort of create the front line across the trench warfare. And so these cars are cars similar to this. If you Google Minervas, the first thing that comes up are Minerva Armored Division. And so they were Belgian armored cars that would sort of pierce the German line. And here we see two Minervas in the action across the Isle of Man. And we see the sort of wonderful landscape of the Isle of Man as they zoom around at high speeds in this 50-some-odd mile long race course. Now, this is certainly one of the most unusual places that I have brought Alive at 5 to you from, to be here in the garage of Cranbrook House. I think it's a telling tribute to Cranbrook that we do have art in every corner, some of it more accessible than others. Now, we have brought tours down here before to see this mural. I think the last time was during the Cranbrook and the Car Show that was curated by my predecessor at the center, Shoshana Resnikoff, and I know they did a tour that brought guests in to see these murals. So hopefully, again, in the future, we'll be bringing guests down to see these works of art. I wanted to walk over to the window for just a moment to, again, show you exactly where we are within the Cranbrook campus. So we're looking out at the lower greenhouse lot, and there you can see the west wing, or the east wing of Cranbrook House popping up. And so where the original Cranbrook garages were, we're actually past the original Cranbrook kennels here, where they kept their hound dogs. And Florence Booth, the youngest daughter, was known for her love of dogs. And the great 1914 Oakland County Dog Show, which is still going on, was canceled because of COVID. But that dog show started in Oakland County at Cranbrook in 1914 here on the Cranbrook property. So the original dog kennels are here. And then the original garages were the next building over. And those garages, which did have additional James Scripps Booth murals, or rather the original James Scripps Booth murals, were torn down at some point in order to allow the East Wing and the Oak Room edition of the house to have more space. And so the entire front court of Cranbrook House was extended and those garages were pulled down. And then the sunken garden is directly behind the greenhouse there. It is a pretty great thermometer there hanging in the window. Now, I hope that you enjoyed this Live at 5 tour. It's a little bit different. Perhaps we'll come back for another Live at 5 when we can discuss our 26-foot mahogany Italian rowboat, which is here in the rafters, purchased around 1915 on Lake Como. That's the reason that we have a boathouse, was for the Nellie, which was named after Ellen, in this rowboat now stored here in the garage, originally down in the boathouse, another one of our cultural properties. Now, if you've been following along on our Instagram stories or on our Facebook stories, you know that Leslie Mayo, the registrar, and I are deep in a 3-year process of checking in on inventorying every single piece of cultural property on the Cranbrook campus. And cultural properties are everything from murals, paintings, boats, furniture, silverware, planters, really anything that is a physical object that is not owned by Cranbrook Art Museum. And so Leslie and I are going building by building by building and checking in on every single one of these cultural properties. It will take us 3 years start to finish. We're just wrapping up Thornley now and starting in on Brookside. So all of these things which feel like they're just such treasures tucked away, and do we know what we have, and are we caring for it the best we can? Just want to assure everyone that though these buildings are being used, we are really keeping track of what we have, and we try to maintain it to the best of our abilities, even in this moment of extraordinary staff shortages and general kind of anxiety here at the institution about what are we doing with all this stuff? We're making plans, we're studying, measuring, doing condition reports, and trying to be the best stewards of this really unique and rich legacy that we can be. I hope you enjoyed this tour, this look at one single set of murals. It's always fun to do a Live at 5 that's really closely focused on an object. And so cars are not something that I am too familiar with. I know many of our viewers are, and that there's many a Booth family member who are deeply invested in the legacy of the Scripps Booth Auto Company in these cars. And so if you have additional feedback, if you want to know more information, you can always send us a message here on Facebook or at center@cranbrook.edu. Now, there are a couple of essays that have been written about the Scripps Booth Auto as well as these murals. And so if you really want to do a much deeper dive, just send me an email and I'm happy to connect you with our archivist to share that information. Now, I said I would close the garage doors for you. I have no idea when this motor was put in, but I find it pretty enchanting. And so the garage doors are being pulled by that motor there, and then the doors are pulled in. A pretty elegant solution to operating mechanically these quite beautiful garage doors, likely designed by Marcus Burroughs, who did much of the architecture here in the support buildings of Cranbrook House. And Marcus Burroughs, who also designed the Greek Theater, the Rainbow Fountain, the Baldwin branch of the Public Library, Birmingham's Police Station, and City Hall. I imagine that he designed these great doors as well. Thanks so much for joining me for another Live at 5 from the garage. I will be back next week for another hopefully exciting visit. I have been working on this one for over a year. I'm really hoping that it's going to come true. We were supposed to be there a couple of weeks ago, and we keep getting pushed down. So next week I'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern for another Live at 5 tour here on Facebook. Until next time, everyone, thanks for watching.